It's pavement in heaven. There's a story of one man who begged and begged and begged to be able to take his riches with him to heaven. So finally, they gave him a dispensation and said, okay, take your wealth. So he packed all his gold and went to heaven. And when he got in, they said, no, you can't bring anything into heaven. He said, well, I got a special permission. Okay, look at it. Sure enough. Okay, what did you bring? So he opened it all up, this heavy bag, and there's all this gold in there. And the angel at the gate looked in there and said, you brought concrete? You understand? Our gold is totally worthless in heaven. God is not needing our gold. And yet humans are piling up gold, right? Everywhere fighting. Have you heard lately the latest thing to do is to put your money in gold? Because paper money is about to go under. And the crisis is worldwide. It's going to affect Australia big time, even though you're better off than the U.S. But when the U.S. goes down, all the small ships chained to the Titanic have to be sucked down too. There's no small ship that doesn't get affected when a Titanic goes down. So it's going to affect Australia. So people are saying, gold, gold, gold. It's like putting your money in concrete. The only way to save your money is put your money in souls. You got to get off the planet alive, and gold will never get you off alive. Okay? So finally the one with one came, and verse 24, then he which had received 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew thou art a hard man, reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not strawed. And I was afraid. I went and hid my talent in the earth. Lo, there thou hast that which is thine. And he pulls out a talent and gives it to him. Now, in church accounting, this is okay. I've written the accounting systems for 2 unions. And when an accountant or treasurer delivers 100% accountability on what they received, we go, well done, thou good and faithful treasurer. That doesn't work with God. God does not want you to give him back just what he gave you. In the church, we're happy when, if you have $100,000 of money that is turned in, you want to give account for $100,000. But this is not acceptable to God and God's way of thinking. He gives you $100,000, you better come back with a lot more than that. You're held accountable for what you could have done with the money. And in this case, it's souls. So he said, and the Lord answered him and said, thou wicked and slothful servant, you knew I did not reap where I sowed not and gather where I have not strawed. You at least ought to have turned my money to the exchangers, and therefore I would have had my money, which is mine, with usury or interest. Take therefore the talent from this man and give it to him that has 10 talents. For unto every one that has shall be given, and to him that hath not, he shall have abundance, and to him that hath not shall be taken even that which he has. And cast this unprofitable servant into outer darkness, and there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The principle here is, God is not asking you to give account for your money. He's asking you to give account for the amount of souls you could have reached. God doesn't own all the souls in the world. There's people here today that have not yet given their heart to God. We're surrounded by people who don't even know God. Australia is one of the most secular countries in the world, right? They don't know God. God doesn't own their souls. They have never given God their souls. They've never gone to God and say, I give you myself. They don't even know who he is. And therefore, God is saying, don't give me that which I already own. Give me the souls. Do something with the money I gave you, because I'm going to ask you to render account for souls. Now, we are coming up to the end times. Let's talk about some little difficult things. In the year 1971, the United States declared bankruptcy. What does bankruptcy mean? It means that all your assets are equivalent to all your debt. If you cash out, you own nothing. Bank ruptured. Bankruptcy, right? It means you have no assets. Your debts are equivalent to everything you own, so you're now penniless. 1971, I was 11 years old, and my dad called me. I just come back from South America with my family, and he let us listen to the radio, and he said, boys, we are entering a time in United States history where for the first time in history, the United States has declared bankruptcy. The next year, the chairman of the Federal Reserve came on, and he said, I have been encouraging Americans to tighten their belt, to save, to work harder, enter more productivity, but it's obvious that no Americans want to do that. Neither are there any politicians willing to pay the price of going into a recession. When you don't have money, what do? You spend less, you work harder. Americans are not willing to do that. They're going to borrow their way and live the same as they always lived, mortgage their houses, borrow money and borrow money and borrow money until the United States can no longer survive. And he forecast approximately a 30-year curve. In approximately 30 years, the United States will cease to exist as an economic nation. That was 1972. 30 years later, 2002. Meanwhile, I've gotten my MBA. I was teaching for Andrews University. I was assigning homework to my students, asking them to do research on it, and the condition was right on track. A little bit later than expected, but it was right on track. The national debt was increasing rapidly. All of the taxes in the whole United States would not even go to pay for the interest on the public debt. Even if the government took every single penny and closed down every service and paid it all, they wouldn't have enough for interest. At that point, there's no hope, right? In other words, there is no way to pay back the loan anymore. And so it's like jumping off the cliff. But what can you do when that happens? You can either acknowledge the debt and deal with it, or you can make it worse. And the book by Larry Burkett, who was a Christian finance, a very famous Christian financier, he wrote a book called The Coming Economic Earthquake, and he died now, but he has a Christian program called Christian Financial Concepts. He gives wise advice to people on how to manage their money from a Christian point of view. But he wrote a book called The Coming Economic Earthquake, and in that book, he says the last thing the U.S. government will do before the final collapse, because they don't have any money, and because they won't raise taxes, because that would be disastrous to their ability to get reelected, they will just print all the money they need. Now, that only accelerates the process. Well, I was in France, doing a week there in France of preaching, and one of the members brought me a French paper, and it said on there, the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress has just voted to print all the money they need to pay the interest, to finance the war in Afghanistan, to finance the war in Iraq, and to finance the security systems going in at all the airports in the United States. Secondly, the next month they voted not to no longer print the M3 figures, which is called a monetary aggregate, which is the total sum of monies that have been printed. In other words, we're going to print all the money we want to, and we're not going to tell anybody how much we're printing. Kind of nice way to write false checks, huh? I'm going to pay all my bills with false checks. How long does that last? Well, all it does is guarantee the absolute demise of the nation in an accelerated manner. Now it's been about 3 years, and now we know that the U.S. government has been printing an average of $3.6 billion a day. The collapse in April was forecast to begin in September this year. I was invited to speak my secondary school, Collegedale Academy at Southern Adventist University campus here. It said, David, it's your 30th alumni weekend. We're asking you to be the main speaker. Would you be willing to? Well, I could not turn down an opportunity to speak to my own fellow students. I hadn't seen them for 30 years. I thought this is the last time I ever will, because by the next time I'm in honor class again, if they invite me, will be 10 years from now. Now is a chance. So I accepted. I came back early from South America, and boy, the devil didn't want us to come. We flew. We barely made it in time. And when we got up to near Atlanta, there was a line of storms from one coast all the way to the other, 20 miles thick, solid, severe thunderstorms. I could not penetrate no matter where I went. So we spent the night sleeping in the airport on the floor. We just landed at the nearest airport and spent the night. The next morning early, the storm had gone through. I flew home. I got a bath. I went to preach. 15 minutes before the sermon, I walked through the door. Whew, Lord, thank you for bringing me here. I decided I wasn't going to preach an easy sermon because it was the last time and the only time I would ever speak to my fellow students. So I entitled the sermon, The Coming Storm. And I preached some very difficult things, and I gave them the evidence that as early as September, the final collapse of the United States economy as we know it would begin. That's the evidence. I said, God can postpone it, but once you jump off the cliff, you're going to hit the bottom. It's just a matter of timing. I said, it could be next year. It could be later on this year. But the evidence points to a beginning of the final collapse in September of this year. While I was preaching to my fellow students, you have to understand, I opened my heart to them, and I had the privilege of rebaptizing one of them just a few weeks later. Because of that sermon, he said, I have to get my life together. And he came back and he gave his heart to the Lord, and I was able to rebaptize him. Some of my fellow students that had never even been to church for 30 years, they got a copy and called me up and said, we never go back to church, but we sure listened to your sermon and we thank you so much. And it made a difference. But what caught me by surprise